I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, the church in China. A bishop's appointment sets the Vatican and Beijing at odds as a Catholic leader is found guilty in Hong Kong. Zero tolerance. Protests against COVID-19 policies target China's president. Lame duck agenda. Bills that are on the table as Congress faces deadlines. We're on Capitol Hill. And White House Christmas. Unwrapping this year's decorations with the First Lady. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us on this Monday of the first week of Advent. Our top story tonight, one of the newest cardinals in the Catholic Church has died. Cardinal Richard Bawav of Ghana died last evening in Rome. He had recently been released from the hospital because of heart issues. He was elevated to cardinal in August, but missed the consistory because of heart trouble. The Vatican says it is praying for his family and the members of his diocese. Cardinal Bawav was 63 years old. Meantime, the Vatican says China has violated the terms of a provisional agreement over the appointment of bishops. In a statement, the Holy See said it had, quote, surprise and regret about the installation of an auxiliary bishop in a diocese not recognized by the Vatican. The statement also said the appointment came after, quote, prolonged and heavy pressure from local authorities. Joining us now from Rome is Andreas Thonhauser, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief. Andreas, great to see you as always. Can you tell us more about what the Vatican is saying?
Yeah, sure. So on Saturday, the Vatican released a statement accusing China of violating its agreement with the Church. The Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association is the branch of the Chinese government controlling the Catholic activities in the country. It seems to have installed a new auxiliary bishop in a diocese not recognized by the Vatican. According to the Secretariat of State's message, this was a clear breach of the provisional agreement between China and the Holy See. Now, last month, this controversial agreement was just renewed for another 2 years. It was the second renewal after its first adoption in 2018. And this document of understanding has been the reason for much controversy. Cardinal Joseph Zen of Hong Kong was one of the most outspoken critics of the Vatican's agreement with China. Recently, Cardinal Tagle, on the other hand, the Filipino pro-prefect of the Dicastery of Evangelization with Chinese roots, defended the agreement as concrete and pragmatic, which helps the Catholic minority in China and secures, as he says, the valid apostolic succession of bishops. The exact wording of the document and the exact points agreed upon in there remain a secret. However, the Secretariat of State made it clear that because of this accord, the Vatican has the last word over the bishops and who is naming them.
And Andreas, it seems China ignored part of this agreement. So what will happen now?
Well, Tracy, as far as we know from the communications from the Holy See, it seems obvious that this agreement has been breached unilaterally. Bishop Chom Beng Hui Chu was installed as an auxiliary bishop in the Diocese of Jiangxi. The problem at hand is not so much that the Vatican would disagree with the ordination of this bishop, but more with the diocese. The Holy See never agreed to this diocese, and the Chinese government still went ahead and created it without the Vatican's consent. In its communication, the Secretariat of State also laments the long and heavy pressure from local authorities that preceded this installation. And at this point, we do not really know how this matter will continue and if it might mark the beginning of the end of the agreement between China and the Vatican. But after all, it's exactly these kinds of bold moves on the part of the Chinese government that critics have always warned of. And on a side note on that, Cardinal Zen had been on trial in China over participating in a fund paying for legal fees and medical treatment for pro-democracy advocates in Hong Kong. Only 1 day after the installation of this bishop, Cardinal Zen was convicted by a Chinese court and had to pay a fine. However, we may understand the immediate reaction of the Holy See as a warning, signaling China that the Church is not willing to accept unilateral breaches of the current provisional agreement, not even smaller ones. We should not forget that Bishop Peng, who was now installed by the government, had been consecrated in 2014 by the underground church in China with the blessing of the Vatican.
And Andreas, on a different note, before I let you go, I understand Pope Francis met a large group of children at the Vatican this morning. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's right, Tracy. Pope Francis met with a group of 6,000 Italian school children and their teachers in a meeting organized by the country's national network of Schools for Peace. In his address, the Holy Father stressed the importance of always striving to build peace. He then said that he wanted to remind his listeners of the examples of two prominent advocates, Pope St. John XXIII and Martin Luther King Jr. The Pope encouraged the children to dream big and also become advocates for peace themselves.
Andreas, thank you so much for that report. We appreciate it. As always, Andreas Thonhauser, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief. Thank you again. Over the weekend in China, there were unprecedented public demonstrations against coronavirus lockdowns. The unrest followed an apartment fire last week, which killed 10 people. There are questions whether measures such as locked doors either hindered firefighters or trapped the victims. In response, Beijing says it will now ease some of its COVID lockdown rules. And joining us tonight with more on this historic protest is Brent Sadler, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Center for National Defense. Brent, welcome. Good to be with you today. Let's get right to it. This sort of uprising is really very unusual in China, really unprecedented, and it brings up memories of Tiananmen Square for some. How significant are these current protests? Can you put this in perspective for us?
Well, under the regime of Xi Jinping, he's actually been able to rule with pretty much a strong political position in Beijing. So it's remarkable during his tenure, but it certainly doesn't quite get to the level that we saw in 1989 with the Tiananmen Square protests, which lasted for a long period of time, several months, and then culminated with a mass killing in Tiananmen Square itself. We're not at that point. It doesn't look like it's going to get to that yet. Unless certain things happen. Right now, the police have been effective in stopping down or stopping any further protest. But the issue is growing and certainly is resonating with a lot of people in China.
Yeah, and Brent, for those that aren't familiar, can you fill us in on China's COVID policy and its rules?
Sure. So it's called COVID Zero, which means there's no tolerance. If you have COVID, you will be quarantine for up to 100 days in your apartment, or in some cases, people are being put out on the street, which doesn't make too much sense either, or in government-provided facilities. In extreme cases, there's stories, there's videos that you can also find that show government workers welding shut the doors to apartment complexes to ensure people adhere to the quarantine rules of that. There's also strict testing requirements. There's also apps that you have that if someone is tested positive around you, that your movements are also curtailed. It's an app that has a famous green or yellow screen on it, which indicates to people that control access to buildings or to public transit your allowance to enter or to pass.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the protests against these COVID policies. We know that crowds in China's largest cities, to include Beijing, and the roads have been blocked. They've been chanting slogans and clash with police. All of this, of course, in a communist country. Tell us, what is at stake for these protesters, and what type of consequences could they face?
Well, they live in a communist authoritarian regime that has a massive espionage and surveillance state network around it. So certainly going out and speaking against Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, you do that at great physical peril to yourself. And so that's what these people are kind of left with. They're at wit's end after months of these COVID policies and very totalitarian and autocratic policies coming out of Beijing. But at the same time, there's still not quite yet that spark that galvanizes the nation in unity against the Communist Party. It's still the ire is against local or municipal political leaders, Communist Party leaders, like in Shanghai or in Wuhan. But this fire in Urumqi does have the potential because landowners, people that have their own apartment, that have witnessing being kept inside, or even knowing people that have been welded into their own apartment complexes, it becomes very personal and it becomes very threatening to their well-being and their livelihoods as well. And so if that if more and more Chinese people identify that they are personally at threat, then this could grow much larger than Tiananmen Square. But right now, it doesn't look like that's the trajectory that we're on.
We have about 30 seconds left or so, Brent, but wondering if you can give us your final thoughts on what we see happening in China and where this might all go.
I think what you're going to see is Xi Jinping and the National Communist Party pulling back from local authority. You're already seeing some of that in the policies and allowing local leaders to make mistakes, as we've seen. So you're probably going to see an uptick of disgruntled but localized disgruntlement and protest. And that'll probably head off any national unity that looks to blame the Communist Party and Xi Jinping himself. That's probably the most likely outcome, but certainly the chances are not zero that there is a much more nationalist awakening against the Communist Party, too.
Well, Brent, thank you so much for your time today. Always great to get your insights. We appreciate it. Tonight, the White House is reacting to that wave of public anger and protests that have erupted in China. The communist nation's stringent COVID policy restrictions confined families to their homes for months. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, good evening to you. Just back from his Thanksgiving break, the president still has plenty on his plate, including a possible rail strike, the war in Ukraine, inflation. But first, we'll get to those developments in China.
In Hong Kong, demonstrators gather for a small vigil to mourn the victims of China's zero COVID policy.
With that, I'm going to just start right away and turn it over to Kirby.
And in the White House press briefing room today, National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications John Kirby was asked about the protests there.
We're watching this closely, as you might expect we would. And again, we continue to stand up and support the right of peaceful protest.
As the U.S. monitors the biggest show of opposition to the ruling Communist Party in decades,
we don't see any particular impact right now to the supply chain as a result of these protests.
Meanwhile, in South America, the United States will ease sanctions against Venezuela while that government resumes negotiations with its opponents. The new policy will allow Chevron to resume limited oil and gas production. In addition, Venezuela agreed to let the United Nations manage a new fund to finance health, food, and education programs for the poor. Also, President Biden said his team is involved in negotiations to avoid a freight rail strike that could further disrupt the economy. And today, President Biden announced a new policy to reduce sexual violence in war zones, which will allow the U.S. Treasury Secretary to file sanctions against human rights violators. And
today's action is part of the president's broader commitment to work to address all forms of gender-based violence.
Now, tomorrow, President Biden heads to Bay City, Michigan to talk manufacturing jobs and building the economy. And today, the RNC on Twitter, the Republican National Committee, slammed the Biden administration, saying, quote, Bidenflation is wiping out the budgets of families. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
We have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including not aboard, assessing the prospects of a railroad strike as unions reject a deal. And the Holy Father asks the faithful to be aware of God's presence in our daily lives. Thanks for staying with us. With just a few weeks left in this lame duck session of Congress, Democrats want to pass as much as possible. Besides the Marriage Equality Act, their wish list includes an assault weapons ban and passing a bill protecting young illegal migrants. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales has the latest on the agenda.
There are a lot of Democrats that want to get things done, and time is short. This week, the Senate votes on a bill to codify same-sex marriage. So far, a dozen Republicans have voted to advance it. But other Republicans, like Catholic Senator Mike Rounds, tells me the bill is not needed.
Well, first of all, the Supreme Court has spoken earlier, and there's no reason for us to try to legislate anything at this point. So I think they'll bring it up, but I don't think it's to our advantage to pass it.
Meanwhile, President Biden is now pushing Congress to adopt a House-passed assault weapons ban.
I'm glad that President Biden is going to be pushing us to take a vote on an assault weapons ban. The House has already passed it. It's sitting in front of the Senate. Does it have 60 votes in the Senate right now? Probably not.
Senator Chris Murphy says he's meeting with a group of Republicans to get the 60 votes needed to pass it. Democrats also want to protect some 800,000 immigrants who came to this country illegally a decade ago.
We know that it's important in December that we pass the DREAM Act, December of this year, when we return from Thanksgiving. Because if the House moves as we think it might politically, it becomes increasingly difficult after the first of the year to take up this issue.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops says it supports the immigration bill. Also on Capitol Hill, the December 16th deadline to pass a budget looms. And we still have an omnibus bill that we got to pass. I mean, budget.
Yeah, you could do a CR. I mean, we'll see. Well, there's not all that much we have to do. We don't have to do a whole lot. We do need to do the NDAA, and I hope we have a big, robust discussion about that.
Congress also needs to pass a National Defense Authorization Act, which some say will be difficult.
I think the number one goal every year is to fund the security of the nation, the defense. A lot of my Democrat friends don't necessarily believe that. They'd rather do some other things. So that is a struggle to try to get to yes.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is urging Congress to pass the NDAA, saying that it's a national security issue. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Joining us to discuss the looming rail strike and more is Vince Coglianese, Editorial Director of the Daily Caller. Vince, always great to see you. A lot to get to today, but first, we are just weeks away from Christmas with an economy already on the fritz. That said, what type of impact do you think a rail strike will have, especially now?
It would be devastating, completely devastating. If the railways stop moving freight in the United States of America, you've seen estimates of some 30% of all freight will stop moving, and that will create dramatic shortages and follow-on price increases, what we know as inflation, as people compete for more limited goods. It'll be a chaos. And so there's every incentive in the world right now for leaders in Washington to figure out a way to stop this, and quickly. There are means to do that. Congress can do that. And of course, the president of the United States would sign off on it. But that takes them showing some courage in order to shore up America's supply lines, which desperately need it right now in the midst of an already a struggling economy.
Yeah, and before the midterms, President Biden said in a 60 Minutes interview that he resolved the strike, but unfortunately, I mean, it looks like we're back at square one again. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, we knew actually at the time that Biden was making that claim that all they were doing was delaying negotiations until after the election. So they made that seem like that they had averted catastrophe when in reality they had only delayed it. And I got to say, I was disappointed in the coverage then. I was disappointed in the White House's claims then that they had somehow saved the country from this rail strike. Just not true. And in fact, in terms of the dishonesty in this past week, we heard from the White House that Joe Biden, President Biden, is, quote, directly involved in these negotiations. But then President Biden himself on Thanksgiving Day told reporters in Nantucket, no, he wasn't directly involved, that White House aides had been handling that. So there are more questions than answers, unfortunately, again, with something that could be an economic catastrophe.
Yeah, and I want to stick with President Biden here. You know, his plan was to take a serious look at a 2024 run over the Thanksgiving break, which, as you mentioned, he was on the Tony Island of Nantucket at a friend's multi-million-dollar estate. What more do we know about this trip, Vince, and also this possible re-election bid?
We saw some reporting going into it that he was going to spend the time consulting with family about whether or not a 2024 run would be appropriate for him. It's not hard to see why that conversation would come up. He's the oldest president in American history. There are certainly questions about his capability to do it again. But on the other hand, the bench that the Democratic Party has kind of thin. I mean, right now, Kamala Harris, who's the vice president of the United States, is definitely not considered one of the favorites because she has a very low approval rating in the United States, just not well liked. And so plenty of Democrats have already indicated that if Joe Biden were not to run again, that this would be a pretty competitive primary. Nobody would just hand it over to Kamala Harris. So right now, Democrats have to figure out what they're going to do, and rather quickly, because that presidential election, it does feel like it's far away, but it's going to be upon us in no time. And certainly there are a bunch of Democrats who are waiting in the wings to find out whether or not Joe Biden is going to do it again.
Yeah, and Vince, a lot going on here in the United States and also around the world. Before I let you go, I want to discuss what's happening in China. As we mentioned earlier, protesters are pouring into the streets. They're fighting over those COVID restrictions. I'm curious, what do you think all these protests signal, and where do you think all this is going?
Well, it's a massive display of unrest in a country where the communist leadership has been able to stop such expressions in the past successfully. Less so this time. Xi Jinping is now in his third term as the communist leader of that country. He is trying to hold together billions of people who are becoming more and more discontented with the ongoing COVID lockdowns. There are unbelievable draconian measures being enforced against the people, from welding their doors shut to abandoning burning buildings for fear of sending firefighters in and exposing them to COVID, to locking Chinese citizens up inside of concentration camps. There is no end to the suffering that we know of. Nevertheless, the stuff that we don't know about inside of that closely kept country. So there's a lot of chaos right now, and I think it's spooking everyone, from people who watch China from afar to Chinese people themselves, as well as the markets, which have become very dependent on Chinese manufacturing and goods. So we, again, wait to see what happens next.
And almost out of time. Very quickly, though, what else is on your radar, Vince?
We're going to be watching really closely the Anthony Fauci's departure. He just did a number of Sunday shows, the doctor who's been kind of really in charge of America's COVID response. If I could relate it to China for a moment, in a deposition he just gave this past week about the government's behavior through all of that, he did suggest that they were looking with envy towards China's lockdown policies very early in the pandemic. So if you're wondering why, in some cases, the United States reached unbelievable lockdown measures, including places like Michigan, where they roped off access to purchasing seeds for your garden, look no further than U.S. officials looking kindly upon some of those tyrannical behaviors we saw in other countries. I hope we learn some lessons from all this.
Absolutely. Vince, always great to have you on and get your insights. Thank you so much. Up next on EWTN News Nightly, advancing abortion. The fight for the unborn suffers a setback in one European nation. Plus, a Catholic leader warns about global threats to religious liberty. We are back tonight. Pope Francis reminds the faithful that God is present in everyday things.
Il Signore vostro verrà. Il Signore vostro verrà.
At a Sunday address to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father said it is time to wake up and be aware of all the ways God is present in our daily life. Pope Francis also said that he is praying for peace amid the recent violence between Israel and Palestine. A church leader from Africa is sounding the alarm over global threats to religious liberty. During an interview with EWTN's Vaticano program, Cardinal Robert Sarah said in part, quote, threats against religious liberty take many forms. Countless martyrs continue to die for the faith around the world. The 77-year-old added religious liberty is not to be taken for granted or compromised or neglected. France's lower house of parliament has passed a bill that would label abortion as a fundamental right. A recent poll shows over 80% of the French population supports the right to abortion. However, Marine Le Pen opposes the bill for its potential to extend or abolish the time limit on abortion. Iran says that it will not cooperate with a UN probe over its response to recent anti-government demonstrations.
اتهام زنی واهی به جمهوری اسلامی ایران.
Separately, Iran acknowledges more than 300 deaths from the unrest. An independent group claims a higher toll. The UN Human Rights Council voted last week to investigate alleged abuses against those protesting the death of a young woman while in police custody last September. Finally, tonight, on a different note, First Lady Jill Biden unveiled the theme for this year's Christmas decorations at the White House. It is We the People. A military band played as guests walked past the decorations featuring dozens of Christmas trees and 83,000 twinkling lights. And in the East Room, you will find a nativity scene with a figure of baby Jesus. About 50,000 visitors are expected to pass through the White House during the holidays. We thank you for watching tonight. And remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.